Welcome to First Do No Harm with Massachusetts Citizens for Life board member and physician Dr. Mark Rollo. This broadcast will focus on medical ethics from a Catholic perspective and address abortion, physician-assisted suicide, contraception, natural family planning, IVF, healthcare proxy, and other topics.
Hello and welcome back to First Do No Harm, a show about medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. I'm Dr. Mark Rollo. Since the beginning of this show, I have spoken about medical ethics dealing with intrinsically evil acts, which can be ascertained to be evil by the application of natural law theory. Simply put, natural law theory tells us, among other things, that the deliberate destruction of innocent life is never justified. This applies to the beginning of life when we are discussing abortion, and it applies to the end of life when we are discussing assisted suicide and euthanasia. These have been the topics that I have addressed so far. There are, however, many instances when right and wrong are not obvious and require some analysis. Such an analysis involves ethical terms such as the double effect principle and cooperation with evil. Cooperation with evil can be subdivided into formal versus material cooperation, immediate versus mediate cooperation, and proximate versus remote cooperation with evil. So, this kind of analysis can get complicated. This is true when we are talking about the ethics of vaccine development. Such a topic is very timely since COVID vaccines have now begun to arrive. I will discuss these vaccines at some length in my next show. During this show, I will lay some groundwork for the discussion of the ethics of vaccine development and use. This discussion will also apply to the way we analyze the ethical nature of any issue. Today I will spend much of my time discussing natural law. Next time I will go into some detail about the principle of double effect and cooperation with evil in the context of vaccine development and use, as well as in medical ethics in general. First, let us begin, as always, with prayer. For as stated by the U.S. Catholic bishops, only with prayer that storms the heavens for justice and mercy, prayer that cleanses our hearts and souls, will the culture of death that surrounds us today be replaced with a culture of life. This prayer today is actually a reflection from St. John Chrysostom, and is taken directly from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 358, which states, God created everything for man, but man in turn was created to serve and love God and to offer all creation back to him. What is it that is about to be created that enjoys such honor? It is man, that great and wonderful living creature, more precious in the eyes of God than all other creatures. For him the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all of the rest of creation exist. God attached so much importance to his salvation that he did not spare his own Son for the sake of man, nor does he ever cease to work trying every possible means until he has raised man up to himself and made him sit at his right hand. Let us pray that the free will given to us by God will always be used to serve him who made us and made our brothers and sisters. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Ethics, including bioethics, is all about choosing right from wrong by use of our free will. Also required are right reason and an informed conscience. There is a great deal of confusion in our secular society regarding these matters. I like what physics teacher Matt D'Antuono, who spells his name D''Antuono, Matt D'Antuono, I like what he recently wrote in the National Catholic Register. Mr. Dentuono is a physics teacher in New Jersey, where he lives with his wife and 8 children. He holds bachelor's degrees in physics and philosophy and a master's degree in special education, and is working on a master's in philosophy. He is a revert, having returned to the Catholic Church in 2008. He wrote the following in the National Catholic Register. I do not think it is too drastic to say that there is a lot of moral confusion today, both about what is right and wrong, and what the nature of right and wrong is. In other words, we tend to be very confused as a society about what we ought to do and why we ought to do it. Worst of all, though, is that we do not know that we are confused. As Plato said, the most damaging thing about stupidity is its self-satisfaction. The first step in learning is realizing that you don't know. Peter Kreeft, author and professor of philosophy at Boston College, has said, "There are 2 kinds of people in the world: the fools who think they are wise, and the wise who know they are fools." When it comes to ethical decision-making, it is important to try not to be a fool. Any discussion about morality, Mr. Dentuono further explains, must start with a common basis. It does no good to shout, "God commands it," to people who don't believe that God exists. That is as good as a starting place as someone saying to me, "The flying spaghetti monster has dictated thus." I don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster, so I don't care what it did or didn't dictate. So a good foundation for the discussion of right and wrong is natural law. This is the theory that right action is always in accord with the nature of the human person. Just as the nature of a violin dictates what you should and should not do to it if you want it to function well, so the nature of the human person reveals how we ought to conduct ourselves so that we can thrive. Even many Christians are not familiar with such a robust theory of ethics that can be discovered simply by sound reasoning. Faith in God is not required to understand this theory of ethics, and yet it agrees perfectly with the moral teaching of the Church. Our faith only adds to this morality. It takes nothing away. So, natural law ethics is the perfect starting point for a discussion of morality, even with people who are not religious. So again, what is natural law? It is simply the notion that humans, unlike animals, have a moral sense that is in their nature. Just as it is in our nature to want to eat when we're hungry and drink when we're thirsty, it is also in our nature to know that some behaviors are acceptable and some are not. People have a general consensus about rightness and wrongness. Prohibitions against theft, murder, and lying are ubiquitous. Virtually every culture and code includes these prohibitions. The 10 Commandments are a good example of this expression of natural law. So-called positive law is different. Positive laws are man-made laws, which may or may not be in accord with natural law. Positive laws are not necessarily positive. The derivation of the word positive in this instance is from the verb to posit, or to put forth. Good examples of positive law or man-made laws that are not in accord with natural law are those regarding legalization of abortion. Such laws are in direct contradiction to the natural law prohibition against the destruction of human life. We need look no further than the recent calamitous man-made law in Massachusetts, which is in direct contradiction to the natural law imperative of protecting innocent life. The so-called ROE Act has legalized infanticide and child exploitation in Massachusetts. Late-term abortion is now legal in Massachusetts for virtually any reason, and neonatal resuscitation in the case of a so-called botched abortion is no longer required by law. Furthermore, a 16-year-old girl can now walk into an abortion clinic, accompanied by her sex trafficker, and obtain an abortion without parental consent or judicial bypass. Clearly, this man-made law does not conform to the traditional notion of natural law. When it comes to medical ethics, the Hippocratic Oath is a reflection of natural law. The initial shows of this program, First, Do No Harm, dealt with the basic prohibitions against abortion and assisted suicide as articulated in the Hippocratic Oath. Specifically, as I have previously emphasized, the oath states, "I will neither give a deadly drug to anyone who asks for it, nor will I suggest such a thing. Similarly, I will not give a woman an abortive remedy." These prohibitions in the Hippocratic Oath are expressions of natural law. Our human nature, when it is not corrupted, is naturally inclined to not commit murder, which is what abortion and assisted suicide, in fact, are. It is only with corrupt intent, obfuscation, and rationalization that man-made law, so-called positive law, can permit abortion and assisted suicide, and thereby overpower or obscure natural law. The journal Catholic Medical Quarterly of the United Kingdom from August 2012 contains an excellent article by Dr. Patrick Guinan, whose last name is spelled Guinan. Dr. Guinan was from the University of Illinois College of Medicine, and he was the past president of the Catholic Physicians Guild in Chicago. He passed away in 2017. This article for the Catholic Medical Quarterly was entitled Hippocrates and Natural Law. The article discussed how there has been a tragic shift away from this virtue-based natural law ethic and toward a more autonomous, relativistic, and utilitarian-based ethic. Recognition of objective right and wrong has declined and has been increasingly replaced by subjective right and wrong determined by each autonomous individual. You know the drill. I have my truth. You have your truth. That person has his truth, and so on. Objective truth is increasingly a foreign notion. Unfortunately, this is not a novel condition. Pontius Pilate asked truth himself, "What is truth?" So natural law has largely given way to positive law, meaning man-made law. The notion of right and wrong is no longer thought to be written in our hearts, but rather in our legislatures and courts. In other words, we essentially say that what is right and wrong is what we say is right and wrong. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is a recapitulation of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 17, which reads, "You are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. From that tree you shall not eat. The moment you eat from it, you are surely doomed to die." If I may be a little presumptuous, I think this is what God was saying. I have written right and wrong in your heart, so don't screw it up. But of course we did screw it up, and we continue to screw it up, just as Pontius Pilate did. when he had the way, the truth, and the life crucified. Another example of the abandonment of natural law ethics and the acceptance of utilitarian and relativistic ethics was offered by Dr. Guinan. The Reichstag, which is the German parliament, declared in 1934 that euthanasia of so-called mental defectives was acceptable, and so psychiatric patients were euthanized by the Nazis beginning in the 1930s. Another example of corrupt positive law trumping natural law is the United States Supreme Court declaring in 1973 that the deliberate destruction of the unborn was legal. There is a parallel in medical ethics, states Dr. Patrick Guinan. Western medicine has, of course, developed and changed profoundly over the last 2,400 years, but it has been remarkably constant in its ethical principles and traditions. The Hippocratic Oath has been the hallmark of the professional medical code and remained essentially unchanged until recently. I discussed this at length in my first show. Dr. Guinan observes in his article that prior to roughly 1945, practically all medical oaths were made to God or to the gods. The appeal to deities reflected an acknowledgement of a superior referent, inasmuch as nature and natural law transcended human decrees and opinions. Since then, there has been a change, and now oaths are made to society, mankind, or even to one's own medical school classmates. A ridiculous thought. Natural law, widely defined as this innate human sense of what is right and wrong, such as the prohibition of murder, lying, and theft, have their counterparts in medical practice. To oversimplify, we can cite several medical areas for which there is general agreement for these prohibitions. These can be put in positive terms. Medicine universally promotes life, hence the dictum primum non nocere, which means first, do no harm. Medicine also universally promotes patient confidentiality and virtue among its practitioners. So there is commonality of the essential elements of the major medical codes. There are certainly no substantive disagreements. Promote life, relieve suffering, be virtuous, support medical education, and guard confidences are themes that are repeated over the centuries and throughout the world's cultures. Dr. Guinan explained in his article that the medical oaths are natural law applied to medicine. It is the golden rule, or the 10 Commandments, written in the hearts of men. The theory of natural law arose in the golden age of Greece, from 600 to 300 BC. This is when Hippocrates and his followers arose. Natural law theory was perfected by St. Augustine in the 4th century and St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. With the so-called Enlightenment came philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. And there was also a shift to the concept of rights of the individual as opposed to the king. The basis of rights shifted from natural law to the will of the people, which, through legislative action, now makes positive law. The reliance on higher powers, including the highest power, namely God, and the reliance on natural law diminished. The Hippocratic ethic reflected deeply on natural law. It was personal and bound the physician to the healing relationship with the patient. This bond does not exist with the autonomous patient or with society as a whole. The physician's time-honored covenant with his or her patient has, in essence, been vitiated. It's no wonder that a physician's morale weakens. This reflection of Dr. Guinan mirrors my own observations over the course of my medical career. There has been a gradual erosion of the bond between doctor and patient. The patient has become more autonomous, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but increasingly the autonomous patient views the doctor as a kind of vending machine who is there to get what he wants when he wants it. Conversely, the doctor is often not even called a doctor, but rather a provider, someone who provides what I want when I want it. This has been a very subtle and gradual transition. At the beginning of my career, I was referred to as a family physician, and at the end of my career, I was a PCP, a primary care provider. A fellow physician recently opined during a conversation that medicine used to be a profession, and now it is more of a business. This makes sense when you consider that a profession implies that you have professed an oath to a higher power. When you instead profess an oath to no one in particular, profession becomes just a transactional arrangement. Doctor, patient, and society suffers as a result. Dr. Guinan further explained in his excellent article that this trend, from a medical oath point of view, crystallized following the world wars, especially the Second. The horrors of Nazi medical experimentation prompted a review of medical codes. This occurred at the time world governance was being formed at the United Nations. The World Medical Association, founded in 1947, promulgated the Declaration of Geneva Physician's Oath in September 1948. The Declaration of Geneva, for the first time, did not mention higher powers. It could be said to have begun the secular era. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated on December 10, 1948. It did not mention medical oaths. The previous Western ethical conceptual domination yielded to a more ecumenical worldview to include not only the Western Judeo-Christian ethic, but also Muslim, Indian, and Chinese philosophy, the latter two of which had no supreme deity. Natural law was also downplayed. The Declaration of Geneva, which, while retaining the themes of the Hippocratic Oath, confidentiality, virtue, and patient health, departed in one major area. It had become a pledge and not an oath. In other words, it no longer had the moral suasion of an oath. The physician was to consecrate his life to the service of humanity, not to a higher power. This was a significant change, reflected the major philosophical shift from natural law to positive or political law. God, or natural law, would no longer be the arbiter of human behavior. Now the will of the majority through legislation would prevail. This break from tradition had dire consequences in that it was the Reichstag's positive genocide laws that resulted in the Shoah, the Holocaust. So also the United States Supreme Court with respect to the legalization of abortion in 1973. A consistent and firm application of natural law would have prevented these atrocities, opined Dr. Guinan. Certainly a firm application of the Hippocratic Oath would have prevented such barbarity. Unfortunately, concludes Dr. Guinan, this change now pervades Western medical schools. Whereas 50 years ago, most students took the Hippocratic Oath upon graduation, now less than 50% do. These pledges that many students themselves devise have watered down the previously mentioned tenets, especially the prohibitions against abortion and euthanasia. They oftentimes are directed not to God, but to their fellow students or to humanity in general. Natural law is the timeless guideline for human behavior, including the practice of medicine specifically. To shift from natural law to positive law in medical practice is to damage a noble medical ethic that has guided medicine for 2,400 years. We should make every effort to prevent this from happening by recognizing our respect for and use of the Hippocratic Oath. If we are successful in properly shifting our focus back to the importance of natural law, we have a basis to discuss medical ethics in general, including the ethics of vaccine development and use. I will elaborate in the next show after a discussion of the double effect principle and the notion of cooperation with evil. Until next time, remember, we should always treat life with care and respect. And at the very least, we should first do no harm.
Thank you for tuning in to First Do No Harm. Dr. Rollo welcomes your questions and comments. You may contact him at markrollo978@gmail.com. That's MARKROLLO978@gmail.com. Thank you, and until next week, remember, first do no harm.